Sometimes life hits you hardest not when you're bracing for impact, but when you're most at ease, standing on the porch of a rented beach house, staring out at the Pacific. My name is David. I'm 48 years old. I'm a structural engineer and I've lived my whole life in Denver, Colorado. My wife, Karen, and I had been married for 14 years. It wasn't perfect, but I believed our marriage was solid. We didn't have kids, but we had a life, routines, a home, habits. Most of all, we had trust. Or so I thought. It started during a vacation. We rented a house by the ocean in San Diego. It was a Saturday in late October. The weather was mild, around 73 degrees, with a gentle breeze coming off the water. I was grilling fish on the patio, and Karen was sitting nearby with a glass of white wine, watching the waves. She always loved those moments. So did I. Out of nowhere, she said, "David, I can't live in a lie anymore. I've been seeing Michael for almost a year." I froze. The name hung in the air. Michael, our mutual friend. We had worked side by side on a job in Broomfield a few years back. He'd been over for dinner, joined us for barbecues. I didn't say a word. I turned off the grill, took off my gloves, and walked back into the house. I sat at the edge of the bed and stared out the window. The waves rolled in rhythmically, just like they always did this time of year. But their sound, once soothing, now pounded in my ears. On the nightstand was a family photo we had brought from home, a snapshot of Karen, Michael, and me at a barbecue 3 years ago. All of us smiling. Her hand on his shoulder. It used to feel natural. Now it looked like betrayal framed in wood. I didn't sleep that night. I played back the past months in my head. Was I blind? Or just too trusting? I remembered March, when she started coming home late, claiming she stayed longer at the gym. New perfume. More time on her phone. I brushed it off then. Fool. Sunday morning, I woke up before sunrise. The kitchen was still dark. I made coffee in silence. I placed her mug by the sink, just like I had done for years. She nodded at me, then looked away. No words. No apology. Just silence. I sat down at the dining table, sipping coffee alone. By 9 a.m., I had booked a one-way ticket back to Denver. I left the house by noon. She didn't offer to drive me. I called a cab. As I waited outside, I looked at the waves one last time. I used to think they were calming. Now they felt like static in my ears. That house, the sunlight, the ocean, none of it belonged to me anymore. Monday, 6:30 a.m., I landed back in Denver. My old Silverado was waiting in the airport parking lot. The weather was colder than in California, low 50s and cloudy. As I drove past the King's Supers on Alameda, people were walking in with shopping bags. Just another Monday. Everything looked the same. But something inside me had broken and hadn't stopped cracking since. On the way home, I stopped at the car wash on 6th and Whitney. My truck needed it, still covered in salt spray and sand from the beach. While waiting, I saw a guy in a denim jacket kiss his girlfriend near the entrance. They laughed. Held hands. I didn't feel envy. I just realized I no longer knew what real connection looked like. When I walked into the house, I noticed right away, her shoes were gone from the front door. She moved fast. Our bedroom closet looked lighter. A few drawers were half empty. She hadn't taken everything, but enough to say she didn't plan on coming back. On the kitchen table sat a phone bill. Among the missed calls was one from Michael. Sunday night. While I was already in the air. I didn't call back. That night, I sat on the back deck with a beer, wrapped in a hoodie, watching the neighborhood settle into sleep. Lights went off one by one across the block. I remembered how the three of us, Karen, Michael, and I, once stood on this very deck, watching fireworks on the 4th of July. We grilled burgers. She laughed at his jokes. I thought nothing of it. Trust is a strange thing. You don't notice it until it's gone, and then all you can see is how foolish you were to give it so freely. A few days later, I found something in our bank statements. That's when I realized, What Karen told me in San Diego was only the beginning. Thursday morning, I opened our joint checking account online. It was just part of the routine, coffee in hand, checking balances. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. But then a number caught my eye, a wire transfer for $18,000, processed 2 days earlier. My first instinct was fraud. My name was still on that account. I hadn't authorized anything. I opened the transaction details. The transfer had been initiated from Karen's login. Memo. Debt settlement. Debt? What debt? I stood up and paced the kitchen. She didn't carry debt. No student loans, no credit cards that I knew of. 18 grand isn't something you accidentally send. That kind of money has intention behind it. I drove to the Cherry Creek branch, the same one we'd been using for years. I waited behind a couple balancing their checkbook, and a young guy depositing a business check. I stared at the floor until I was called. The banker, clean-cut, maybe late 20s, asked for my ID and login. I said, "I need to review recent transfers on my joint account." He looked at the screen, said, "Yes, Mr. Walker. That transfer was completed via the co-owner's online access. Would you like to file a dispute?" I shook my head. "Just print me everything from October through today. All activity." Back in the truck, I sat there in silence with the paper in my hand. It was all there: gas stations, groceries, pharmacy runs. But then 4 larger withdrawals stood out. Over $26,000 total. One at a travel agency. One at a jewelry store in Scottsdale, Arizona. Scottsdale. I remembered she told me she had a weekend seminar for work there. That had been months ago. Or maybe not. Time's slippery when trust evaporates. That night, I sat in front of the TV but didn't really watch. Just background noise. I kept looking at the photo frame from San Diego that I still hadn't unpacked. Something about it made me feel sick. Friday morning, I called her. I didn't want answers. I wanted to hear how she'd lie. She answered on the 3rd ring. She said, "David, I didn't expect." I said, "You moved 18,000 from our joint account. What debt are you paying off?" She paused. Then, "It's personal. I didn't think you'd notice." I said, "It's a joint account, Karen." "Of course I noticed." She said, "I'll pay it back. Eventually." I asked, "Was it for Michael?" Another pause. She said, "We should talk in person." I ended the call. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed, holding that same photo. My thumb brushed over her face. Not in anger. Not in longing. In disbelief. Because I no longer recognized her. And maybe never did. Later that week, I drove past a place I hadn't been in over a decade, and saw something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the hotel bed staring at the ceiling, trying to map out every step I'd need to take next. No calls, no shouting, no showing up at the house in some emotional storm. That's not how I operate. My moves needed to be quiet, cold, and final. The next morning, at exactly 7:05 a.m., I walked into the First Interstate Bank on Lincoln Avenue in Scottsdale. The same branch where Becky and I had opened our joint account back in 2015. The same branch I hadn't stepped foot in for over a year because most of my transactions were handled online or via Base Pay. I walked up to the same teller I remembered from all those years ago, a woman named Charlene who always wore too much perfume and remembered our dog's name before she remembered ours. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone even. "I'm here to close a safety deposit box in my name and withdraw remaining balances from 2 accounts." Charlene's brows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Do you have ID, sir?" I handed her my military credentials and driver's license. "Of course. Please give me a moment." Within 15 minutes, I was signing final documents. Everything was already moved. I had routed my last paycheck to a private account a few months earlier. I kept my face blank as I watched the final numbers come up. Becky had cleaned up the joint checking, just like the email said. But what she hadn't touched, couldn't touch, was the survivor benefit account and the military housing dividend fund. She probably didn't even know those existed. I left with a certified check, a receipt, and no expression on my face. At 10:22 a.m., I walked into a legal office downtown and handed a folder to a man named Clark Thomas, an attorney specializing in military divorce who owed me a favor from back in 2017, when I helped his brother out of a sticky situation overseas. "Everything's in here," I said. "Her filing, the bank records, her cohabitation with a third party. The deed still lists her name, so I'm invoking Clause 13 of the VA transfer rule. I want a motion filed today." Clark flipped through the documents, whistled softly, then said, "You're playing this clean. I'm not here to throw mud. I'm here to end it. Quietly, legally, and permanently." He nodded. "I'll have the motion drafted within the hour." I stood. "Good. I'll be in touch." I didn't contact Becky. Didn't reply to her email. But I did send one message, to the base housing office, revoking her right to enter the property while I was still deployed. By evening, I was on a flight back to North Carolina for a mandatory strategy meeting. 3 days later, I received confirmation that the court had granted an injunction barring Becky and Jeremy from liquidating any further assets, and that proceedings had officially begun. The house, of course, was still in my name. She hadn't anticipated that. She also hadn't expected my return to be this swift or this silent. I made no social media announcements. I didn't call family. I let the gears turn while I stayed in the background. Quiet, deliberate. Let her wonder. A week passed. Then, on a Thursday morning, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring. Then it buzzed again. And again. By the 6th call, I picked up. I didn't speak. I just listened. A woman's voice, ragged, panicked, familiar. "Nathan, I didn't know. I didn't think you'd. Why are they here? They're saying I need to leave." I ended the call. Because that wasn't my problem anymore. But what was my problem? Well, that came the next morning, in the form of a letter I wasn't supposed to receive. A letter that wasn't meant for me at all, but landed in my mailbox just the same. And what it said made everything I thought I knew feel like just the beginning. And what it said made everything I thought I knew feel like just the beginning. It arrived on a Tuesday. The envelope was plain, white, nothing written on it but my name. No return address. No postmark. It was slid through the door like a flyer. But it wasn't a flyer. I picked it up, turned it over, and for a second, I thought maybe it was from the attorney. But Clark never sent things by hand. He emailed, he called. This was personal. I opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One sentence. Printed in bold black type. "You don't know half of what they've done. Look into her last trip to Austin." I read it 3 times. Austin. Karen hadn't mentioned Austin in over a year. At least not to me. The last I'd heard about it was some HR seminar she claimed to attend back in April. She came back with a tan and a pair of boots she said were on clearance. I remember joking. "Did the workshop cover cattle management too?" She laughed. I didn't press. I stood in the kitchen holding that letter, my coffee untouched. Was this a prank? A friend trying to stir things? Or something more? That night, I logged into our old shared travel rewards account. We hadn't used it together in over a year, but the login still worked. I looked up April. 1 reservation came up. Hyatt Regency Austin. 3 nights. King room. 2 guests. 2 guests. The name on the second line? Michael W. Kennedy. I closed the laptop. I sat there in the dark, breathing slow. Not angry. Not surprised. Just disappointed in how deep it went. She hadn't confessed to that. She chose San Diego because it sounded less orchestrated. But this had planning behind it. It wasn't an accident. It was a sequence. I couldn't sleep. So I drove. Midnight. The streets of Denver were empty. I ended up at a Waffle House on Colorado Boulevard, the kind of place where everything smells like syrup and tired truckers mumble their orders. I sat at the counter, ordered coffee. Black, the waitress said. Long night? I answered. Just a long year. By 3 a.m., I was back home. I sat at my desk, opened a clean notepad, and started writing dates. Dates she traveled. Dates she said she was working late. Names. Cities. Anything that no longer felt random. By 6 a.m., I had a list that looked more like a case file than a marriage. That afternoon, I paid a visit to a friend. Alan works in private security. We did some consulting work years ago when I was redesigning a courthouse downtown. He owed me a favor. I said, I need someone discreet. Someone who can confirm movements, bookings, timing. Nothing illegal. Just clarity. He said, You want surveillance? I said, I want the full pattern. No guessing. No assumptions. I want a timeline. He nodded. Give me a week. That week passed slow. I stayed busy. Reorganized the garage. Fixed the back porch railing. Replaced the old furnace filter. Anything to keep my hands moving. 7 days later, Alan called. He said, You should come by. There's something you'll want to see. I drove straight to his office in Glendale. He handed me a flash drive. It's all there, he said. I watched the files in his office. Flight records. Hotel check-ins. Restaurant receipts. Video footage in 3 cities. Not just Karen and Michael. Someone else. A third man. Tall. Dark hair. Seemed to know Karen well. Hugged her in a way Michael never did. One video, outside a cafe in Phoenix, they kissed. My stomach turned. Alan said, That guy's name is Tom. Tom Elridge. He's not random. We think he owns the firm Karen consults for. I sat still. This wasn't a love triangle. It was something else. In the final file, there was one image, just one, that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the screen without blinking. Because in it was something I had hoped I'd never see. It was a still frame pulled from security footage. The resolution wasn't great, but it didn't need to be. I recognized the sidewalk. I recognized the car. And I recognized the jacket she was wearing, the same one I bought her for her birthday 2 years ago, from a boutique in Boulder she loved. But none of that mattered. Because in that image, Karen was handing something to Tom. A manila envelope. I stared at it. There was no mistaking the gesture. Not casual. Not romantic. It looked like a transaction. His hand was flat, palm up. Hers hovered above, fingers tight around the folder. They weren't smiling. They weren't talking. Just exchanging. Alan said, It's from last month. Camera outside a shared office space in Flagstaff. We ran Tom's business profile. He's not just a consultant. He's listed as the managing partner for a private arbitration group. Real hush-hush work. I said, What kind of arbitration? He said, Corporate dissolution, civil cover-ups, internal fraud. Big money off-record disputes. That sat heavy. I left with the drive. I didn't watch the other clips. I didn't want more speculation. I needed clarity, not chaos. Back home, I sat in the garage. The door half open, cold air rolling in. I remembered the last time Karen asked me to change the garage code. It was right before her seminar in Austin. She said she kept forgetting it. I thought back to that envelope. What was inside? Documents? Money? Something else? Wednesday, I went back to my attorney. I said, I want to subpoena the business. Elridge Group. I want financial records, correspondence, anything with her name on it. He said, You'll need to show grounds. She's not listed as an employee. I replied. Then we start with phone records. Her last 6 months. Use the Arizona footage. Tie her to him. That's enough to file for discovery. He nodded slowly. All right. But this could get ugly, I said. It already is. A week later, I received the first results. Her call log had a pattern, repeated numbers, same windows of time, often while I was at work or traveling. One number came up 37 times over 2 months. It wasn't Tom's. It wasn't Michael's. It belonged to a woman named Elise Caldwell. I didn't know the name. I Googled it. She was listed as a senior accountant for a shell company based in Tempe. Registered under a holding trust. No public offices. Just a P.O. box. I sent everything to Alan. He called back the next evening. He said, "That P.O. box links back to an offshore account. Cayman Islands. The trail ends there, but the deposits, there's a pattern. Someone's moving money." I asked, "How much?" He said, $74,200 in the last 90 days. 2 deposits marked from domestic sources. One of them matches the transfer Karen made from your joint account. My hand tightened around the phone. I said, "So she's laundering through intermediaries. Not just hiding it, burying it." He said, "That's how it looks." I stood by the window that night, staring at the street. The silence in the house was complete. I hadn't seen Karen in over a month. Not in person. Not by chance. But then, 2 days later, I did. She showed up where I least expected, and she wasn't alone. It was a Sunday morning, overcast, light snow falling. I'd just come back from a hardware store off Colfax, picking up replacement parts for the furnace fan. My Silverado was still idling in the driveway when I saw her. Karen. Standing at the curb. Hair tied back. No makeup. Holding a small suitcase in one hand and a leather folder in the other. Next to her, a man, tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a dark wool coat and polished shoes. Not Michael. Not Tom. Someone new. I stepped out of the truck, closed the door, and waited. She looked tired. He looked nervous. I said, "You're not supposed to be here." She said, "We need to talk." I replied, "Talk to my attorney." She said, "This isn't about the divorce. It's about the company. About what Tom pulled. You need to see this." She opened the folder. I didn't reach for it. The man beside her said, "Mr. Walker, I'm Jason Myers. I'm with the IRS Office of Internal Fraud. Karen has been assisting in an active investigation. Your name came up in a flag transaction. You're not a suspect, but we need your cooperation." I stared at him. She said, "I didn't know what they were using me for." Not at first. The money, the accounts, it was all a front. Tom was laundering through Elridge Group, using me as cover. I thought it was consulting. I looked at her, quiet. She added, "I have documents. Names. Timelines. But they're not safe in my hands anymore. I need to turn them in." "You're the only one who can help me." I asked. "Why me?" She said, "Because they won't touch you. They know your background, your clearances. If I disappear, no one asks questions. If you do, it's different." Jason handed me a card. It had a case number. Federal seal. Real. I said, "This folder, what's in it?" She answered, "A ledger. Access keys. Offshore accounts. 2 more names you haven't heard yet. One of them works for your firm." That stopped me cold. I took the folder. I said, "You have 5 minutes." We sat in the garage, door down, truck off. She showed me emails. Ledger entries. Bank routing instructions. Encryption keys. And a memo. Dated 2 weeks ago. Marked, "Internal Termination Protocol." I said, "They were cutting you loose." She nodded. "Or worse." Jason said, "We need to move quickly. By Monday, this network starts going dark." I said, "What do you need from me?" He replied, "A signature. Testimony. You validate that these came from Karen's devices and that you saw Elridge at your firm's function last spring." I said, "He was there. Briefly. Didn't stay long." Jason said, "That's enough. I signed. Nothing dramatic. Just ink on paper. Karen said. I'm sorry. For everything. I said. Don't be. Not now. They left. I watched them drive off in a gray rental Camry. Snow starting to thicken on the windshield. I stood in the silence of the garage, folder in hand, pulse calm. That night, I received an anonymous message from an unlisted number. It said only this. She lied again. And the next lie will cost you more than money. I didn't sleep that night. The message sat in my phone, its words burned into my mind. She lied again. And the next lie will cost you more than money. No number. No signature. Just silence on the other end. By morning, I changed all my passwords. Bank email, cloud storage. I shut down the shared cloud Karen once had access to. I rerouted the security feed from my house to a local encrypted server and double-checked the garage lock. Then I called Alan. I said, I need surveillance lifted from Karen. Full focus on Myers. Background check. Travel records. Contacts. I want to know if that badge was real. He said. Understood. Give me 48 hours. I stayed in the house the rest of the day. Restless. Watching the street. Reviewing the folder she'd given me, again. Something didn't sit right. Late that night, Alan called back. He said, Myers is real. So is the badge. But there's no active federal case under that number. It's registered to a different investigation entirely. One involving government contractors. I said, Karen wouldn't know that. Alan paused. Then said, That's the thing. She might. The next morning, I drove to a quiet office park in Arvada. One of the buildings belonged to the firm where Karen once consulted. I waited outside in my truck, drinking bad gas station coffee and watching. At 10:42 a.m., a man walked out, Tom Elridge. Not hiding. Not rushed. Calm. Confident. He got into a Lexus, plate partially obscured by a dealership frame. I followed. Not close. Not obvious. But enough to trail him through 2 turns and across the bridge onto I-70. He exited near Golden, pulled into a gated facility marked West Valley Logistics. I stopped on the side road and snapped a photo. Back home, I ran the company through databases. Shell. Owned by another trust. Same P.O. box as the one Elise Caldwell used. It wasn't just Karen. It wasn't just Michael. It wasn't even just Elridge. It was layered. Structured. And somewhere in that structure, someone knew my name. I called Clark, my attorney. I said, I want everything frozen. No settlements. No sign-offs. I want forensic review of every joint asset. Every property transfer. He said, David, what's happening? This isn't a divorce anymore. I said, It never was. Not really. That night Karen called. First time since she left the folder. I let it ring twice. Then answered. She said, They're watching me. I think they know I gave you the file. I said, You said you wanted out? That this was your chance to fix things. She whispered. I lied. Silence. I didn't speak. She added, I was working with them. Until they turned. Now they're burning it all down. You need to disappear. I said, Too late for that. She started crying. Not loud. Just steady. I ended the call. 3 hours later, I got an email. Anonymous. With attachments. Photos. One of me. Taken from across the street. That morning. I stared at the timestamp. Then I packed a bag. I locked the house. Closed all accounts. Took my passport and headed for a motel off I-25. No calls. No forwarding. The next morning, I checked into a small cabin rental near Steamboat Springs. Paid in cash. That's where I'm writing this. Not because I'm running. Because I'm watching. And waiting. Because no matter how far this goes, no matter how deep it runs, I will finish it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, about real men who don't shout. They act coldly? To the end?